Howdy and welcome to the Strange West Podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trentano. Leading us in as always with their rendition of Eno Mariconi's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like your guitar slingers like you like your gunslingers, then head on over to MitchPolzak.com. That's Mitch, Polzak.com. In tonight's podcast, the Cowboy Vs Nazi action comes to a stunning and final conclusion in Chapter 25 of Paris High Noon. By yours truly, Trentano. Can't wait to get your Cowboys vs. Nazi on? Then head on over to ParisHighNoon.com. Both paperback and ebook are available at ParisHighNoon.com. Paris High Noon t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other swag are available at Society6.com/Trentano. Both Paris High Noon and the Mustache t-shirts are available at Society6.com/Trentano. And as always, a big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. James put in a lot of time and effort into the podcast. Good luck out there, James. I hope to work with you sooner rather than later. So now, without further ado, is the final chapter of Paris High
Noon. Chapter 25, Showdowns and Sunsets. From the trapdoor of the special freight car, Black Bart watched the gunfight raging up ahead. The chase train was about 30 minutes behind when the SOS came over the radio. Black Bart called the engineer up front and told him to speed up. Down in the freight cars, the SS gunfighters prepped their motorcycles and Kubelwagens, double-checked their weapons, and got ready to do what they did best. Next to the motorcycles was a large bay, saddled up with lungs full of wind. Hoff had laughed at the notion of going after the old cowboy on a horse, so Black Bart had him ride in the other coach to lead the second team. If it were up to Hoff, he would have filled the prison train with a battalion of SS gunfighters, but Black Bart overruled it. Too much resistance and Catfish might decide to cut his losses, not attempt the rescue. So Black Bart took a page from the Pinkerton Detective Agency book on chasing down outlaws. Surprise had worked with Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, so the SS gunfighter figured on using it to catch Catfish's La Bande Sauvage. Suddenly, the diesel let out a long whistle and slammed on the brakes. Black Bart fell from the trap door onto a few of his own men. One SS gunfighter got slammed between two Kubelwagens and screamed. The bay reared on its hind legs and cried out. Black Bart got to his feet and picked up the phone line to the engineer. "What the hell is going on?" "Sir," the voice on the other line said in a panic, "the other train is backing up on us. Fast. We have to abandon the train." Black Bart smashed the receiver against the wall. "Sergeant Scheer." Scheer was busy trying to free the trapped soldier from the Kubelwagens. "Sir." "Get the men out in 2 minutes or they're dead. Radio Hoff and tell him to do the same." Scheer got on the radio and Black Bart screamed orders to the men. They threw open the freight doors, pushing the vehicles to the door. Black Bart took the reins of the frightened bay and led it towards the door. He saddled up and dug in the spurs. The horse jumped out of the freight car, landing on the steep cut. Black Bart almost lost the reins, but was able to hold on with one hand. The bay got its footing and slowed. Black Bart turned around. The men had gotten the motorcycles out and were working on the Kubelwagens when the rear of the prisoner train slammed into the diesel locomotive. The two trains buckled up, jumped the tracks, and rolled over the other side of the cut. A huge fireball rose up, followed by a thunder that almost blew Black Bart off his horse. Black Bart fought to get the bay under control. Up the cut, he could hear his men in the darkness. He had to trust that Hoff and Scheer would be able to get the men organized. With the flames high above flickering the valley in shadow, Black Bart pointed the bay down the cut towards the dark waters of the Marne. Without losing a stride, the bay plunged into the dark water, crossed the river, and hit the east bank, quickly regaining its pace. Black Bart rode up to where Connor and Goose had set up the machine gun. Empty brass casings and ammo belts littered the ground. He followed the trail down the spur and into a small clearing below the train tracks. Hundreds of horse tracks rutted the dirt. Black Bart got off the saddle and pulled out an electric torch and put his nose to the ground. One horse print, steadier than the rest, led the other south. Black Bart mounted up and followed the tracks that ran almost single file through the forest and open pastures, spurring the bay up the rugged hills and down towards the Petite Morin River, where the tracks hit the water. Black Bart crossed the river easily, going east along the south bank to pick up the trail. After a mile, he turned back west, but there were no signs that Catfish left the river. Black Bart cursed to himself. He was too focused on the prize and not the game, assuming Catfish would take the outlaws south towards Vichy. The bay plunged back into the river, coming out the north side and riding east. A mile into the ride, Black Bart found where Catfish came out, the tracks going back north across the Marne. All night the bay had traveled hard and fast, but it still had enough wind to take the Marne one more time. This time the tracks came out almost right across from where they went in. From there, the trail went north. Black Bart followed through streams, bramble, across roads and the thick woods. The sun rose quickly, burning off the cool morning air. Crows cawed across open wheat fields that were ready for the scythe and the sickle. Trees stretched out their branches, spreading out leaves while flower buds became bloated with blossoms waiting for the sun. By mid-morning, Black Bart had pulled rein on the lathered bay. He had followed the trail to the outskirts of Chateau Thierry and Bella Wood. He was close. Black Bart could almost smell the old cowboy. He took his time, following the tracks and keeping an eye out along the trail. Black Bart didn't think Catfish would set up an ambush, but that didn't mean he wouldn't. About 5 miles in, the terrain broke into a large open pasture that surrounded an old abandoned chateau, sagging with rot. Black Bart got off the bay and looked at the tracks. The upturned earth was still moist and fresh, probably only an hour old. Black Bart took out his binoculars and scanned the area. A wisp of smoke rose up from the chateau chimney. Black Bart smiled a hard smile. As the sun marched towards Moue, he saddled the bay and spurred it to the nearest town. It was a long, hard night for outlaws, prisoners, and horses. They took advantage of the chaos after the train wreck and rode off south before wheeling back north. Catfish knew that Hiccup and the other prisoner wouldn't last long on the hard trail to Vichy, let alone Spain, so the old cowboy hoped to buffalo any Wehrmacht posse by making them think the outlaws made a beeline for the border. The plan was to lay low for a few days and rest up before striking out for the channel and their rendezvous with a submarine. The chateau walls bowed out visibly from the inside, and what furniture was left was rendered useless long ago in the remnants of the living room. The dapper prisoner was asleep on a rough pallet of coats and saddle blankets. Next to the busted fireplace, Connor had a small fire going, while Bonnie was upstairs sending a message to London. That the train hold-up was mostly successful. Hiccup lay next to the dapper prisoner on a straw mattress. Goose was out back with the horses, taking off the saddles and rubbing them down, a chore usually done by Jean. Moue sat by herself on the staircase, tugging at the red scarf. Catfish gently shook Hiccup. "How you holding up, pard?" Hiccup looked up at Catfish from his makeshift bed and winced. "Good." He would gladly take the pain in exchange for freedom. A weak smile spread across Catfish's mouth. It was here almost 20 years ago, among the shattered trees of Bella Wood, that he lost Lee, and it was here that he saved his most dearest. A peace that had eluded Catfish for 2 decades finally settled as the burden was lifted. Catfish gave Hiccup a sip of water from an empty ration tin. "Never thought we'd both be back here after all these years." Hiccup looked up at Catfish. His lips trembled more than usual, but he was able to say, whiskey. Catfish took out his flask and took a long pull. Then he put it to Hiccup's lips and carefully poured a light nip into Hiccup's trembling mouth. The amber steadied his lips and loosened up his tongue a bit. "The man that is after you, he said you made him a promise. He intends to make you keep it." "A promise? Did he say when?" "Brazos Billy's Wild West show in Munich." Catfish's mustache dropped. That act had toured throughout Germany, each show full of little kids who wanted to be cowboys. But it was all just a sad joke, with Catfish being the butt of it. The Wild West he, Lee, Butch Cassidy, Professor Brown, and thousands of other cowboys and outlaws rode and rampaged through was over. The only way Catfish could make a living was to become a parody of himself. If he made a young boy any promises during that time, they were probably nothing more than pretty lies. Catfish looked over at Jean. There was another boy he let down, another promise that couldn't be kept. Catfish wanted to tell Jean that he was sorry, but that wasn't what Jean wanted. What Jean wanted, Catfish was afraid he couldn't have. For his part, Jean sat at the broken window, his face dirty and tear-stained, staring out past the wheat fields and beyond the woods. He felt numb to the world around him, like he was watching his own life rather than living it. The last few hours didn't seem real. Not even Moue's kiss could shake the melancholy from his heart. The one moment he dreamed of had cost him the only family he had left. Catfish's words came back to him. Seeing your friends die is part of being an outlaw. The loss of St. Jude was heavy on all of them, Jean most of all. But it was Jean's grief, and he had to figure out how much of it a burden it was going to be. Catfish had taught him as much as one old man could about the ways of the world. Moue sat on the second step, slipping a finger nervously around the red scarf. Since she made the drop back in Paris, she had wondered if Richard got her note. Now she knew he did, and Jean's brother was dead because of her. She was certain the Germans would find them any moment, and they would either kill her or hand her over to Richard. Whether Richard would take her back or dispatch her like Lana depended on his perception of her loyalty. Moue had to convince him she'd been double-crossing Jean since she left the Happy Flower. Richard was no fool, and if he thought for a moment that she'd make one of him, she was done for. If she wanted a chance with Richard, Moue had one last Judas act to perform. She had to hang the scarf as high as she could to signal the SS posse where they were. But Moue didn't move from her seat on the stairs. She looked at Jean, who hadn't spoken a word to her or anyone else since the train holdup. Moue wanted to say something to him, anything, that is, except the truth. Bonnie came from the second floor and knelt beside Hiccup. He dressed the poor man's wounds and gave him a shot of dope to keep the pain at bay. "Thanks again, Catfish," Bonnie said. He nodded his head to the dapper man who was laid out in a dope sleep. "That's Colonel Ghislaine. He was one of the resistance leaders I was supposed to rendezvous with. He says the communists sold him out." At the word communist, Moue put her hand to her throat. The red scarf felt like a noose around her neck. She glanced upstairs. It could be all over for her within the hour. All she had to do was walk up those steps and tie Richard's red scarf outside of the window. The Germans would do the rest. Then she looked at Jean, staring out the window, mourning for his brother. It didn't matter which devil she picked. Moue would be burning in hell nonetheless. Moue untied the red scarf and got up from the step. She walked over to Hiccup, whose head was cradled in Catfish's arms. She wrapped the scarf around a cut on Hiccup's palm. Catfish took one of her shaking hands and held it. Thank you. Moue closed her eyes. Tears rolled off her cheeks and fell onto Hiccup. She wondered if the old cowboy would understand why she did what she did. Both had done terrible things, but only Catfish had learned how to live with them. Moue stood up and walked over to Jean. She put her hand on his shoulder, but he didn't turn. He just kept up his stare at the green fields. Jean, Moue said, Her hands, so used to serving coffee and liqueurs that also wrote the note of betrayal that got St. Jude killed, gripped his shoulder with as much compassion as possible. I'm sorry about your brother. Jean didn't say anything. He kept his stare outside. Moue let go of his shoulder and knelt by his side. She looked up at Jean as if he were Christ on the cross. I've been betraying you since you left me at the Happy Flower. Jean turned. What? Moue met his eyes, as much as it hurt. I had no choice. When your mother died, I had no one. I was alone. So I went to the only person who could help me. I went to Richard Rouge. He took me in and protected me from the Boche. He sent me to the Happy Flower to wait for you. And when you found me there, at first I told you what I thought you'd want to hear. But then, I don't know. Moue broke off and placed her head in her hands. The melancholy in Jean left quickly, replaced by a rage he never knew. He stood up and grabbed Moue by her arm. You sold us out? How? When? When he left the cafe near the Plat de Sauzet, her voice trembled. You went to scout ahead. I left a note telling Richard about rescuing Hiccup. He took it to the Boche, and they laid their trap. Jean grimaced. Why didn't you tell me? I tried. I wanted to tell you back at the cafe. Moue's voice became stronger. Did you not even notice? Probably not, because you were so busy trying to be a man. You had no idea what I was going through, nor did you care to. I tried to tell you, but then I saw Richard and it spooked me. And my God, Jean, I was staring at the Plat de Sauzet where the Boche beat me within an inch of my... Jean threw Moue against the wall. She hit with a thud and fell hard. I could have taken care of you. Moue turned her face to Jean's. Her eyes leaked tears and her voice burned with guilt and rage. You have never taken care of me. When I needed you the most, you ran away. Oh, sure, it's easy for you to be brave with your guns and murdering friends. What did I have? Nothing. No one, Moue shouted. You left. Madame died. I had no one. Those Boche and Flicks beat me until I pissed myself, then kicked me onto the streets with nothing. What was I supposed to do? Find an old cowboy and ride off with him? You left me, Jean, when I had no one but the devil. So I made the deal, because a live traitor is still alive. Jean stood above Moue. His gun hand shook above the butt of the revolver. And my brother? Was Jude a part of the deal? Moue dropped her head. They only wanted the old cowboy. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. They just wanted the old cowboy. Richard said he would protect me if I gave him Catfish. Connor pulled out his pistol and aimed it at Moue. I guess the party's over, he said. The girl stepped on the cake. A loud click echoed in the old chateau. Jean pointed his revolver at Connor, hammer cocked back and finger on the trigger. Jean loved Moue as much as he hated her. If anyone were to kill her, it would be him. Bonnie stepped forward, holding his arms out and his hands up. Let's take this slow. Bonnie looked at Connor. Put the gun away, Sergeant. That's an order. Connor slowly tucked his pistol in his belt, keeping it within easy reach. Moue got to her knees. She put her forehead against the barrel of Jean's gun. Jean's hand shook, His finger trembled on the trigger. It was like Catfish had told him. Picking up a gun was like picking up God's judgment. For all the times he pulled the trigger, he never felt much remorse. Instead, it was always a hot feeling washing over him, leaving him cold. Sean pushed the barrel of the revolver into Moue's forehead. Moue screamed, "Go ahead and do it. Shoot me down like a dog and run for your lives. But if you think you're doing something noble, you're not. None of you are. And that's your ugly pride. It's just as horrible as my betrayal." Catfish watched silently, cradling Hiccup's head. He didn't try to stop Jean from killing Moue. The old cowboy knew that by rights, Jean would be pardoned for sending Moue to hell. Only Jean would have to live with it. Inside the abandoned chateau, the moment between forgiveness and vengeance hung between Jean and Moue. Jean thought of St. Jude he'd never see again, and his trigger finger tightened. Then he thought of a world without Moue and knew he didn't want to live there. Moue waited for the hot lead to end her suffering. Jean struck Moue across the face with his pistol, knocking her onto the floor. "That's for my brother." Blood from the cut on Moue's face mixed in with her tears. Jean put the pistol back in the holster. "Killing you would be a mercy that I'm not about to give. You're not going to get off that easy. I want you to live and remember what you did to me, my brother, to all of us." Jean stretched out his hand, but Moue didn't take it. Jean grabbed her by the arm and picked her up. "I won't forget what you did," Jean said. Moue kept her head down. "I'll forgive you one day, but not now. Now I need your help." "Oui," Moue said, averting her eyes from all those around her. Finally, Catfish spoke up. "What happened, happened." Catfish turned to Moue. "How much time do we have until the Boche show up?" Moue shook her head. "I don't know. Richard told me to hang out the red scarf, and when the Boche arrived, to surrender. But I never did it. I decided not to. Don't you see?" She pointed to Hiccup's freshly dressed hand. "They may not come at all, but they'll be looking." Goose came in after hearing all the shouting. The thought of the Nazis coming for them washed away any weariness he felt from last night's long ride. "Maybe they haven't found us," he said. "Maybe the Boche all got blown to hell back at the bridge." "I ain't gonna wait around for maybe," Catfish said. "Best saddle up the horses." Goose headed back outside. "Connor," Bonnie barked out. "Radio London and see what they can deliver." Connor nodded and ran for the stairway. Bonnie helped Ghislaine while Catfish hoisted Hiccup. Jean grabbed Moue's hand. "Help me with the horses." Moue nodded and went outside to help Jean and Goose. The outlaws hoped against hope that Goose was right and all the Nazis on that chase train were burning in hell. Outside, the crows cawed and then scattered at the sound of a Panzer's cannon firing. The shell tore into the east side of the chateau, blowing a hole in the crumbling wall. Along the tree line, machine gun and rifle fire peppered the worn-out facade. About 24 soldiers broke cover and charged. Once again, all hell broke loose along the green Bella Wood. Shot and shell tore into the old chateau. Goose came running back in. "Christ almighty," he yelled. "The whole Wehrmacht is after us." "Calm down," Catfish said. "Hop on the big gun and throw some lead their way." "But they have tanks," Goose said. "We might as well whip out our peckers and piss on them." "You can do that as well," Catfish replied. "But I reckon that gun will be more of a deterrent than your pride. Keep their heads down while we get the wounded to the horses." Goose manned the MG-34, firing a long burst that caught the charging soldiers out in the open. Another shell from the Panzer burst into the front room. Shrapnel and splinters tore through, hitting Catfish in his left leg. The old cowboy fell to the ground. "Catfish," Jean shouted. But Catfish waved him off. "Get Hiccup to the horses." Jean hesitated. He didn't get to say goodbye to his brother. To be denied that chance again would be too much. Catfish saw the anguish in Jean's eyes and gave a weak smile. I'll be okay. The quicker you get Hiccup to a horse, the quicker you can help me. Jean picked up Hiccup over his shoulders and ran for the horses. The fire was coming fast and thick. Moue had his horse saddled up and ready to fly. Black Bart looked across the open wheat field at the west end of the Chateau Terry. Even with over half his force knocked out, Black Bart was able to secure 2 panzers and a rifle platoon from a garrison battalion. They pounded the old chateau and riddled it with bullets. When Hoff arrived, he'd wanted to call in a squadron of Stukas to blow the old chateau to hell. The train crash, which was messy and might therefore impede Hoff's chances of promotion, had instilled an uncontrollable desire to annihilate the old cowboy and his gang. But Black Bart didn't want to blow up Catfish. His plan was to cut off any escape while turning up the heat. Catfish and the others would have no other choice than to come out with their hands up. After the surrender, Hoff would take the outlaws back to Paris. Then Black Bart and Catfish would settle their business. Black Bart looked through his field glasses. The shaky chateau had taken such a beating that it threatened to completely collapse. Have the men cease fire, Black Bart ordered. Are you mad? Hoff said. Blow the goddamn place to hell. I said cease fire, Black Bart said. No, Hoff shouted back. I have my orders from Berlin to make sure that the old cowboy is dead, along with anyone else who rides with him. Hoff pulled out his Luger and pointed at Black Bart. In the name of Der Fuhrer, I hereby take operational control of this mission. You are relieved, Major Schwartz. Hoff took his eyes off Black Bart and turned to Scheer. Sergeant, escort the Major to the rear. In one quick motion, Black Bart pulled out his Luger, aimed it at Hoff's head, and pulled the trigger. Hoff saw the play go down, but couldn't get his fingers to work fast enough. The bullet blew out the back of Hoff's head and ricocheted off the side of a Kugelwagen. The rest of the men looked at each other silently. Is there anyone else who challenges my command? Black Bart said, with the pistol smoking in his hand. Scheer looked down at Hoff's body and then at Black Bart. An uneasy silence settled over Bella Woods. Is there anyone? Black Bart shouted. A crow cawed from the edge of the field. Then a high-pitched roar came from the blue horizon. 2 Spitfires swooped down, firing their .50 caliber machine guns, chewing up the trees and the SS gunfighters beneath them. One of the Spitfires dropped a bomb near a Panzer. The blast threw the tank and half a dozen men into the air. The Spitfires circled a few times, strafing the soldiers below. On the last run, they emptied their guns and hit the last Panzer with a second bomb. The flyboys circled their planes north, dipping their wings before flying off into the horizon. Catfish looked up at the planes and waved his hat to them. "God-damn son of a bitch," he said with a big smile. "To think how many banks I could rob with one of those." Bonnie came over to Catfish. "Connor's dead," he said. "And we need to get moving. How bad are you?" Catfish looked up at Bonnie and shook his head. "Bastard's got me in the leg." Bonnie took a look at the wound. The shrapnel tore off most of his calf. Bonnie gave Catfish a quick hit of dope, then wrapped up the leg and braced it the best he could. Jean ran back, kneeling by Catfish. "I'll carry you," he said, and picked up Catfish, dragging him to the back of the chateau. "Leave me here, son," Catfish said. "I'm too banged up to make it to the channel without slowing you down. Besides, there are others who need your help more than I do." Jean looked around him. Dust and debris still floated around the chateau. Goose had left the big machine gun and held the horses. Hiccup and Colonel Gislaine were in the saddle along with Moue. They had little time for goodbyes. "I won't leave you," Jean said. "I'll stay." "A dead hero is still a dead hero," Catfish said with a weak smile. "In France? Hell, the whole world needs a man like you to stay alive as long as possible." "My time's done," Catfish said. A brave but dying smile arched across the old cowboy's face, the silvery mustache arcing like the wings of a tired angel. It was done a long time ago, and I was just too stupid and stubborn to realize it. I lived my time, and this is my place. The only thing that's guaranteed in this world. I'm proud of you, Sean. I don't know if you were brave or dumb to follow an old fool like me, but the rest of the trail is yours. Bonnie came over and grabbed Jean by the shoulder. The Jerrys will be regrouping soon. There isn't much time. Can't you call in some more planes? Jean asked. Bonnie shook his head. Radio went with Connor. Catfish looked at Jean. Help me to the machine gun. I'll hold him off as long as I can. Jean picked up Catfish and carried him over to the MG-34. He loaded up a fresh 100-round belt and charged it. Once Catfish was settled in, he smiled and stuck out his hand. Jean took it and didn't want to let go, but he did. It was the last thing that Catfish taught him, to enjoy those sweet moments, then let them mellow with memory. Jean, Moue called from outside. Jean smiled at Catfish. See you along the trail, pard. He turned and ran for the horses. Catfish looked outside. A few SS gunfighters started across the field. All right, you sons of bitches, Catfish yelled. Let's see you chase the rabbit. The machine gun caught the soldiers in the open. The first burst hit two. The others ran back for the woods. The Germans had turned their guns on the chateau when Black Bart ordered another ceasefire. Sir, Scheer said, they're getting away. Should I take a squad and go after them? No, Black Bart said. Let them go. But, Scheer hesitated, our orders were to kill or capture the old cowboy and his gang. Black Bart took out a white handkerchief, picked up a rifle from one of the dead soldiers, and tied it to the barrel. Make sure no one fires, Black Bart said to his top hand. I'll take care of this once and for all. But, sir, Scheer said, what about Berlin? What about Himmler? They don't matter anymore. Black Bart took out a letter from his jacket pocket and handed it over to Scheer. Add this to your report, Sergeant. It absolves you of any responsibility. Scheer took the letter. Black Bart smiled and stuck out his hand. It's been an honor and a privilege. Scheer shook Black Bart's hand but didn't smile. He watched his commander walk off into the middle of the wheat field, waving the color of truce. Some of the men leveled their rifles and machine guns and were ready to fire when Scheer stopped them. If these were Black Bart's last orders, he would see to it they were kept. Once Black Bart got halfway through the open field, he stopped. Come on out, Catfish, Black Bart said in his best cowboy English. The trail has come to an end. Come on out and surrender. Catfish had the machine gun aimed at the big man in black. He could have cut the man in half, but the audacity of calling him out piqued his curiosity. Why should I come out just so you Boche bastards can hang me from the nearest tree? I ain't going out of my way to make my death easy for you. Come on out, Black Bart said, and we can end this the way you want it to end, the way it's supposed to end. Catfish got up from the machine gun and hobbled to the blown-out wall. How do I know your boys won't cut me down once I'm out in the open? They have their orders, Black Bart said, and you have my word. I hope that you don't find it too insulting if I say I don't trust you. I could have killed you 10 times over. If you want to die like a man, you'll come on out and face me. You're not the only cowboy in France. Catfish hobbled out into the wheat field. His left boot was filled with blood. They stood not 15 paces apart. It had been over 30 years since they had a good look at each other. Catfish eyed Black Bart carefully, trying to match the face with a memory. The man looked familiar, but only faintly. So, Catfish said. His gun hand rested easy near the butt of the peacemaker. You're the man who's been looking for me." "No," Black Bart said. "I'm the man who found you." "Not a lot of men can say that, and those who can are dead," Catfish said. His blue eyes hardened around the edges. "You're no exception." Black Bart tossed the rifle with the handkerchief. "That's right, I did catch you. I did it because I was a better cowboy than you. And if killing you is the final proof, then I'll take my chances." "Well, that's mighty brave of you," Catfish said. "But I don't have enough bullets to kill all you Bosch sons of bitches." Black Bart smiled a hard smile. "You only need one." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the big bullet, and tossed it to Catfish. Catfish caught it. He ran his thumb over it and took a quick look at the bullet. The brass was worn and dull, but the primer was still good, and the lead slug clamped tight around the cartridge. It was a bullet for a Colt .45 Peacemaker. The wind picked up, hot and heavy with the scent of ripe wheat. Catfish breathed it in and fingered the bullet. He saw the wet face of a young boy, younger than Jean, looking up at him. It was a summer day in Munich, where folks crowded the city from all over Bavaria to see Brazos Billy's Wild West show. Along with the Braun Linde Wurmstrasse, the men of the southern German cowboy clubs rode along in their own parade, dressed in a mixture of dime store cowboy regalia and gold Bavarian chains, while members of the Indian clubs rode and chugged on stone steins, their feather headdresses flopping about. On the south end of the Theresienwiese, behind the stockades and corrals full of hardy mustangs, cow ponies, Texas longhorns, and even a few buffalo, Catfish drove off a gang of older boys who'd been picking on a young Bavarian. It pained him to see the tears rolling down the child's chubby cheeks, so he tried to cheer him up. "If you're looking for the entrance, son, you're at the wrong end." The boy turned up his tear-stained face. "Only thing you'll find back here are flies and horse exhaust." Catfish stuck out his hand. "Name's Catfish." "Howdy." The kid spoke broken English, but had his cowboy lingo down pat. He reached out and placed a chunky, calloused hand in Catfish's. "Bartholomew Schwartz." Catfish looked at the big man in front of him. The silver death's head and SS lightning bolts glimmered in the noon sun. Slowly he pulled out the Peacemaker, opened the gate, and slid the .45 long cartridge into an empty cylinder. He snapped it closed, slipped the Colt back in its holster, and squared himself against Black Bart. "I remember you now. You're that boy I let ride with me around the arena." "Yes," Black Bart said in a tight voice. Strangely enough, Catfish remembered that note of sorrow. It was what compelled him to take the young boy backstage, find him a costume, and make him part of the act. He remembered the boy clinging to his waist, hollering like a coyote as they rode around the arena during the bank hold-up scene, the air full of dust, gun smoke, and cheers from the crowd. Afterward, the boy had begged Catfish to take him with him. He promised to be good. The boy had seemed so desperate that Catfish half considered it. "You promised me you'd come back," Black Bart said, the words choking in his throat. "That you would see me on the trail. I looked and waited for you, but you never came." Catfish took in the accusation. He'd failed this man, like he'd failed so many men. When he mounted up after the show and saw little Bartholomew's downcast eyes, Catfish took one of the .45 long cartridges off his gun belt and flicked it to the boy, who caught it and held onto the shiny brass as if it were a nugget of gold. "You never know when you might need it," Catfish said. "I'll see you along the trail, pard." And when he saw bitterness creep into the young boy's eyes, he added, "That's a promise." Catfish shook the hazy memory from his head. It always surprised him what folks held on to and what they let go, what they say and what they mean. Well, it looks like I kept my promise, Catfish said. The end of the trail is still the end of the trail. In fact, it's the most important part. Black Bart remembered that day too. Waving goodbye as his hero rode off, the dust of the horse's hooves faded in his memory. Black Bart took a deep breath. I needed you earlier, before the Great War. Each time my father beat me, I prayed you'd come take me away. Catfish sighed. So you had a rough childhood. Join the club. It ain't exclusive. Black Bart's face tightened as bile built up in his throat. His voice trembled and his hands shook. You don't know what I had to sacrifice to live. They made me kill my best friend. I murdered him with my bare hands. You think that makes you special? Catfish lashed out. I left my best friend to die 300 yards from where you're standing. I left Lee bleeding in a shell hole, and you Bosch bastards killed him. I've carried that burden the rest of my life, but I've come to realize, too late maybe, that no matter what decision I made, Lee would have ended up dead anyways. We all end up dead. It's how we live that matters. The wind picked up, blowing the smoke and smell of gasoline from the blown-out panzers across the open fields. That's right, Black Bart said. He opened his hands and gestured at the ruin around him. And this is how I live. You made me hope to be a cowboy, a hero. It was the cruelest thing you could have done. If you're looking for a hero, go to a graveyard, Catfish said. The morphine was wearing off, and he could feel his leg pulsing with a growing, dull pain. Soon it would get to the point where he couldn't stand it any longer. He was tired and just wanted to lie down and rest. Life as a cowboy isn't all sunny skies and good water. It's a hard life, so hard it can kill, which it has to many a man I knew. What you wanted to hear, what everybody wants to hear, are pretty lies instead of ugly truths. The Wild West was dangerous, full of cruel and greedy people who'd just as soon slit your throat as look at you. The best a man could hope to do was survive. Catfish risked a sideways step to shift the weight from his bad foot. He winced but never took his eyes off Black Bart. You and me, son, we did the best we could. Maybe that wasn't good enough, and maybe we let some people down. Maybe worse than that. But the world moves forward, never backwards. I always said that the measure of a man is not making a right or wrong decision, but how he deals with the consequences. You've borne yours as much as I've done mine. I guess that makes you a cowboy enough. Black Bart let out a long sigh. His face relaxed, the thick eyebrows drooping. I guess that doesn't matter anymore, Black Bart said. The burden he had been carrying all his life had left him, leaving only weariness. Nothing matters anymore. Not the war, not my orders, not even your gang. So what now? Catfish asked. Black Bart shook his head. I can't let you go. Even if I did, my men would gun you down. What about you, son? You don't have to die. Black Bart let out a sad laugh. But I do. There's a bullet waiting for me in Berlin. Himmler and I never did get along. He brought his hand closer to the butt of his Luger. If we couldn't live on our own terms, he said, at least we can die the way we want. The crows cawed. From the town of Chateau Thierry, the first of the noon bells began to toll. Catfish nodded. The second bell tolled. I wouldn't want it any other way. The third bell tolled. Black Bart took a few steps back while keeping his eyes on the old cowboy. The fourth bell tolled. Above, from the cloudless sky, came the faint buzzing of another Luftwaffe bombing run, headed north. The fifth bell tolled. Black Bart unsnapped the dust flap on the holster to his Luger. The sixth bell tolled. A breeze rolled in off the hills, filling the air with the scent of the harvest. The seventh bell tolled. Catfish eased the weight off of his left leg. It wasn't the first time he'd gone into a gunfight wounded. The eighth bell tolled. All the hardness that had built up in Black Bart's life was quickly dissolving into this moment. The ninth bell tolled. Catfish wondered if this was how Butch and Sundance went down in Bolivia. He couldn't help but grin at the notion of Butch looking down on him right now. The 10th bell tolled. From the wood line, Sergeant Shear and the rest of the SS gunfighters watched with held breaths. The 11th bell tolled. Black Bart remembered that day with Catfish back in Munich. It had an earthy smell to it, much like the wheat field. The 12th bell tolled. 2 shots rang out, and the crows flew away. The echo of the gunshots and bell tolls rang through the green hills and thick woods. Catfish was dead before he hit the ground. Black Bart's aim was true and straight, hitting the old cowboy in the chest, exploding his heart, and blowing out his back. All he could do was fall to the ground, his blue eyes going soft, like the sky above. Sergeant Shear ran out of the trees. Black Bart stood tall, staggered, and tried to put the smoking Luger back in its holster, only to have it fall to the ground. "Sir!" Shear shouted as he ran for Black Bart. Black Bart didn't hear his top hand. The slug from the peacemaker had hit him low in the chest, blowing out his right lung and sending his organs into shock. His chest struggled to rise. His breath was raspy. Black Bart looked at the old chateau. The trail leading to it looked long and endless. Then a red haze, like a sunset, washed over him. Shear called out for a medic. The crows returned to their perch on the roof of the old chateau. The drone of the bombers faded over the horizon, while the sun continued its slow march over the green fields of France. Epilogue. A wrong that cannot be borne. "Speak to me of France," said a tall, thin man in a uniform. He stood up from a high-backed leather chair. The logs crackled and popped in the fireplace inside the top-floor suite of the Connaught Hotel. Jean didn't know if he should salute General de Gaulle, the symbol of free France. Instead, he did what the man asked him and told him everything that happened. From the shootout at the Happy Flower to the last time he saw Catfish at Bella Wood. When Jean was done, de Gaulle grabbed his hand and shook it. "To each man his duty." The general leaned forward. "And if every man does his duty, France will be free." Jean nodded, and the general gave Jean permission to leave. Out on the streets, Jean felt more lost since he and the others landed in London. After a week of running and dodging the SS posse, they'd reached the Channel coast. Jean hadn't wanted to get in the little boat that would take them to the submarine. He wanted to go back to the old chateau, where the last thing he'd seen was the look of love on Catfish's face. The 3 of them, Jean, Moue, and Goose, were being held in an old girls' dormitory outside of London, where the British asked them all about their ride through France. Captain Bonney offered Jean a chance to join the SOE, but Jean was hesitant. He didn't take a shine to being around military folks. As for Moue, Jean wanted to forgive her. Her betrayal stemmed from survival, and Jean couldn't fault Moue any longer for the choice she made. It was his biggest hope that after the war ended and France was liberated, the two of them could get on with their lives together. But Jean could never be sure that they could have that life as long as Richard Rouge was alive. As far as Jean was concerned, it was Richard who forced Moue to turn Judas, got his brother killed, and sent Catfish to his death. And as long as the red bastard drew breath, he was a threat. Jean turned a corner and headed for the Thames. The river flowed through London, slipping under stone bridges and lapping along the rocky bank. It reminded Jean of the Seine in Paris. An anger that he had never known filled his heart. For Catfish, St. Jude, and the woman he loved, Jean swore vengeance on Richard. No matter how many Germans he had to kill, who stood in his way, or who fought by his side, one way or another, Jean Malheur would see to it that Richard Rouge paid for what he'd done.
Howdy and welcome back to the Strange West Podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tano. Well, that about wraps up the Cowboys versus Nazi action in Chapter 25 of Paris, High Noon. I'd like to thank each and every one of you who has tuned in. I hope you all enjoyed the series. And if you want to get more Cowboy versus Nazi action on, then head on over to ParisHighNoon.com. Both paperback and ebook are available at ParisHighNoon.com. Paris High Noon t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other swag are available at Society6.com/TrentTano. Both Paris High Noon and the Mustache t-shirts are available at Society6.com/TrentTano. And once again, a big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. He really did bring Paris High Noon alive. James did put in a lot of work into this, and it definitely does show. Good luck out there, James, and I look forward to working with you in the future. And now, sending us out as always with their rendition of Eno Morricone's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like your guitar slingers like you like your gunslingers, then head on over to MitchPolzak.com. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you who has tuned in to the Paris High Noon series. The Strange West Podcast will continue. Until then, happy trails.